Hi and welcome back to Love English. I'm Leila and in today's lesson I have got a question for you. Yes, you. In today's lesson I'm going to share what I think are 7 of the different ways that the English language is sexist. And I want you to answer the question, do you think the English language is sexist? Comment below and share your opinion at the end of this video. Let me see if I can convince you that English is a sexist language. Now, before I get started, let me explain exactly what I mean by sexist. Sexism, like racism or ageism, is a prejudice or discrimination against one of the sexes. So, predominantly, meaning most of the time, this is directed towards women. We live in a patriarchal society, and therefore the majority of people in power are indeed men, whether that's politics or the business world, and therefore women have often been at a disadvantage. Now, although things are clearly changing, both in the workplace, in Hollywood films, and yes, even politics, there are still often underlying tones of sexism in various industries. And what today's question poses is whether that sexism is based on ideology and basically the way society thinks, or whether language is contributing to that sexism. Now, I'm not just going to complain, I'm going to suggest ways that we can balance this out, that we can encourage more gender-neutral language that doesn't prejudice either men or women, to ensure that you don't offend anybody in the workplace, at university, down the pub, in your day-to-day life, basically. That the language you use shows that you are aware that women are equal to men, because we are. So even growing up, you probably came across a lot of sexist language, but you might not have realised it was sexist or the impact it may have had in your perception of the opposite sex. Now, many of the phrases I'll share with you right now can be considered sexist both towards men and women. Think about these phrases. Man up. Big boys don't cry. Boys will be boys. You throw like a girl. Don't be so girly. All of these phrases are suggesting that girls are weaker in some way to boys. And this can be detrimental to both girls and boys. We want to encourage a society where men are free to express their emotions just as much as women. So many of these phrases nowadays are actually frowned upon. And again, we're moving away from this kind of language, socializing children in this way, to showing them that boys and girls are equal, which means that they can both cry and be strong, throw a ball well or throw a ball badly, but not throw a ball like a girl. Now, the next 7 features of English that I'm going to share with you now are ones that are commonplace amongst the adult world. So let's have a look and start with the first. Number 1, the use of gendered pronouns. Now, our pronouns for men and women, he and she, him and her. However, when talking about an application form for a job, when referring to a definition in a dictionary, we don't necessarily need to be using he and she all the time. Why? Because we have a gender neutral one. They, them. This can be used in replacement of he or she. Of course, you'll also find he and she put together. However, this itself can actually be offensive to those that don't necessarily see themselves as being either male or female. So the gender neutral pronoun, the one that we would more commonly use these days, is they or them. There is a simple solution here to not offend anybody and to not be referring to just the one sex, which is usually the man. Use they. Each student is required to buy his own book. Each student is required to buy his own book. Instead, use each student is required to buy their own book. Each student is required to buy their own book. Neutral and not sexist. Now, number 2, I think, is probably one of the most sexist forms of English. The inclusion in many generic nouns of man or male, And essentially what we see here is the dominance of the male sex in the English language. Let's look at some examples if you're starting to feel a bit confused. Chairman, chairman, he's the chairman of the company. Mankind, mankind. Policeman, policeman. Fireman, fireman. Manpower, manpower. We have girl power, which essentially in itself, by referring to women as girls, is actually weakening them and making them seem less than they really are. You wouldn't say boy power to a bunch of men at a table. You would say manpower. So why do we say career woman but not career man? Again, implying that being a career woman is something different, something that most women are not. It's special. In the same way, we would have a housewife. However, in recent times, this has begun to evolve, and you can see terms like house husband. Again, working mother, but not working father. It really is a little bit peculiar. Now, these days, you are finding that words like chairman is becoming chairperson. Policeman becomes police officer. Fireman becomes firefighter. Not fire officer, firefighter. So we're trying to gender neutralize some of these generic nouns so that basically we're not stereotyping women or men in this way. So be careful, listen very carefully for these generic pronouns with man in them, and then try and find a more gender neutral alternative. Right, word ending affixes. So basically a noun and then adding the female part of the word. So you would take a word or a job like actor, and instead of actor, you would say actress. In the same way, we'd have landlord and landlady. We have comedian and comedienne. We have host and hostess. Now, you might think that this is a little bit silly, but in fact, there are those who argue that by adding the affixes, these parts at the end of the word, it actually trivializes the position of the woman. It suggests that it's less than the male equivalent. For example, usher, the job of helping people to their seats, and usherette, is actually a suffix that can mean smaller, less than, and used to create words like kitchenette, meaning small kitchen. So usherette and usher, usherette, what is that? A smaller usher? It's basically creating connotations to suggest the female role equivalent is less than the man's. And of course, if we look at today's society, we see that women and men need to be paid equal pay. Even recently, we have found that men and women doing the same jobs in our society get paid differently. This has caused massive outrage in all industries where this happens. And so maybe avoiding using these affixes, these endings on words, will actually help us eliminate this bias, this negative stance towards women performing the same role as men. And in fact, I have noticed that many female actors do refer to themselves as actors rather than actresses. They don't want to trivialize their position. And there really is no need to have two different words for the same job, whether you're a man or a woman performing the role. Doesn't make sense. Okay, number 4, and this one I really believe is actually something that is very sexist in the English language, to the degree that I have actually chosen not to change my name, my surname, and my title when getting married. So let me ask you this question. In English, before a man is married, he's usually referred to as Mr. Occasionally in the past, a little bit old-fashioned, we'd say master, usually referring to younger children. But generally speaking, men are Mr. Women, before they're married, are Miss. Now, when a woman gets married, her title changes. You can see this on application forms where you have to tick Miss, Mrs, or there's a third option, Ms, okay, MS. Now, when a woman gets married, her title changes to Mrs. But when a man marries, does his title change? No, essentially not. And in this way, I really do feel that women are being judged on whether they are married or not. And to me, it seems ridiculous. So, as an alternative these days, you can actually use the third option, Ms. Now, In the past, ms was actually used for women that were divorced. Again, another way to stereotype women and basically see them as less, giving them their position in society. You're either single, married, or divorced if you're a woman, but if you're a man, you remain Mr. no matter what. So as ms was used for divorced women, nowadays you can actually choose to use it as a way of basically not revealing whether you're married or not. In fact, what difference does it make whether I'm married or single, or indeed divorced? So these days, what was used as a title for divorced women can now be used for women who do not want to be judged on whether they are married or not. A little bit like the Mr. equivalent. So ms. Now, as I said, I also haven't changed my surname getting married, something I find a little bit strange when you marry in the UK and actually in America as well, that you change your surname. Interestingly, in countries where you might think this is commonplace, like Iran or Italy, you don't need to change your surname to your husband's, obviously, not just a random surname. So in fact, I haven't changed mine, and instead of using Miss or Mrs., I use Ms. Now, in addition to this form of address, there are other ways to refer to a man or a woman based on, well, their marital status or lack thereof. A man, if he's single and a little bit older, is usually referred to as a bachelor, and very often an eligible bachelor, meaning he's a good catch, somebody you'd want to marry. But if you're a woman and a little bit older, in fact, if you're about my age, in your 30s, and you're not married, there is also a term to use. And it is very derogatory. It has many negative connotations. A spinster, a spinster. So a spinster is an unmarried woman. Sounds terrible. It really is an old-fashioned word that these days should not be used and would be considered an insult. And yet, why is it that a man who is unmarried has a really nice, attractive word to refer to himself as being a bachelor or an eligible bachelor? There is no such thing as an eligible spinster. Why? Because women after a certain age are seen to be less desirable, perhaps. So again, we are stereotyping. We are making life very difficult for women indeed. So, bachelor and spinster, perhaps we should just throw those words out the window and avoid using them. And in the same way, and this is possibly a little more negative, in fact, yes, it is more negative, a man, when he's free and single and dating lots of women, is a womanizer. Good for him, he's a bit of a womanizer. Again, positive connotations of a man being free, single, having lots of ladies, having fun. But when it's a woman doing the same thing, going on lots of dates, enjoying herself, being young, free and single, she's referred to as some of these words. Yes, very negative, and basically suggesting that she is available. Yes, it's very, very negative, not nice, and basically very sexual in its undertones, its connotations. So a man is a womanizer, but a woman, not pleasant and really not fair at all. Stereotyping men and women in very different ways. Women very much in a negative way and men in a very positive way. So there we have it, just another way that English is sexist. Number 5, yes. I don't want to say these words. Insult terms. Let's have a look at some of them. Now, interestingly, all of these insult terms, the ones for women, are actually referring to, as we were speaking of earlier, women being available, having a lot of sexual partners, basically. And yet, the equivalent for men, well, it doesn't really exist. We don't have this number of insult terms for men as we do for women when referring to having a number of sexual partners. So the language, the bad language towards women seems to be much more prevalent than it is for men. There are many more insult terms like this referring to women than there are for men. A very sexist feature of the English language indeed, and these words I suggest you never use. Now let's be fair, there are also insult terms for men, but what these are usually referring to are parts of the male anatomy or certain actions. So we're not insulting them by saying they're having sex with lots of different women, we're insulting them by their man parts. Yes, that's how it works in the UK. Not particularly pleasant, and again, rather sexist and stereotyping of both the sexes, but in particular, it does seem to be more negative towards women. Now, in English, you will find that we have ready-made phrases, collocations that need to go in a particular order. And when it comes to men and women, it is always a man and then a woman. I just said it, men and women. I don't say women and men. I say women and men, women and men. We have the man, the male role coming first and the female last. For example, we would always say husband and wife, not wife and husband. We would say brother and sister, not sister and brother. We would say boyfriend and girlfriend, but not girlfriend and boyfriend. They go in this order. These ready-made phrases suggest, perhaps, that the man comes first and the female second. But is that always true when it comes to collocations? We say knife and fork, not fork and knife, but it doesn't mean that we think a knife is more important than a fork. So comment below and let me know. Do you think these ready-made phrases are sexist or just a natural part of English? They don't really have any meaning, any sexist meaning at least. Now finally, proverbs. Proverbs. Proverbs are a set phrase that usually has some meaning, some moral for you to understand, to take away something and have learned something from the proverb. Let's see if you think these proverbs in English are sexist. The first, the way to a man's heart is through his stomach. The way to a man's heart is through his stomach. So what does this proverb mean? Well, essentially, it's suggesting that to get a man to fall in love with you or to marry you, you need to be a good cook. You need to serve them and feed them their dinner, make them happy. Basically, it's rather sexist. Why is it that a woman should be feeding a man and cooking for a man and not the other way round? Luckily, I married an Italian, so I'm quite well fed, and actually he probably cooks more than me. Perhaps it should be the way to a woman's heart is through her stomach. It sounds really strange, and men would probably themselves find this quite insulting to suggest that they need to cook for a woman, to serve her, to wine and dine her. Number 2, women are as wavering as the wind. Women are as wavering as the wind. And this phrase, this proverb, suggests that basically women can change quite easily. It really does suggest that they're weaker, that they haven't got a mind of their own to make a decision and stick to it. So it is quite an insulting proverb. You wouldn't describe a man as being wavering. And finally, number 3, the third proverb, patience is a virtue always in a woman, never in a man. Patience is a virtue always in a woman, never in a man. In this case, we've actually got a proverb that's actually more directed towards men. It really does sound quite insulting to suggest that women are the only ones that are patient and men do not contain this quality. In fact, it says that they never have this quality, this virtue. So, proverbs, sexist proverbs, have you got any equivalent in your language? And what impact do you think they have? Do you think they actually affect the way we perceive men and women? Does it encourage us to stereotype women in one role and men in another? Comment below and let me know. And finally, just a little food for thought. As many of these expressions and phrases that I have explained to you are perhaps becoming less common, what we're finding is through social media, there are more phrases being generated, more words, more expressions that perhaps are equally sexist and insulting towards both men and women. Let's look at a few examples. Girl boss, mumtrepreneur, mumtrepreneur, CEO, rather than CEO. To mansplain, mansplain, meaning for a man to explain something to a woman that she already knows. We've got dad bod, basically referring to a man that's got a little bit of a belly on him that maybe is a bit more relaxed because he's too busy looking after his children. And a man spreader, the way a man sits and takes up a lot of space, spreading his legs out and showing his masculinity. So these phrases that have actually become very popular hashtags on social media are in fact equally insulting to both men and women. What this suggests is that we shouldn't just be worried about the old expressions in English, the old phrases, the terms that you think your grandparents might use, but of course not you, But be aware of the fact that new language that evolves naturally through things like social media, can still be equally negative and sexist. So, next time you want to use one of those words, or indeed any of the others that I have looked at, think twice, especially if you're in a situation where you need to make sure that you are respecting the opposite sex. So, what I want you to take away from this lesson is to get you to think a little bit more about the language that you are using, ensuring that whether you are a man or a woman, you are treating the opposite sex with the same respect that you would expect them to treat you with. Basically, we need to encourage a more equal society, and language is a part of that. It really can make a big difference and help us create a more equal society. Thank you so much for watching. I hope you've enjoyed this different lesson, but I also hope you've found it interesting.